Good evening and welcome to the 18th meeting for fiscal year 2024 of the Milton Planning Board. We are here, some of us, and we apologize for the technical issues we've had this evening, but some of us are remote and some are in person. If I would like to now introduce those of us who are here in person.
Jim Davis, Planning Board member.
And on Zoom, we have for our planning board members, Sean.
Apologize, Sean Fahey, Planning Board member.
We can't hear them. Cheryl.
Cheryl Tagayas, secretary.
Maggie.
Maggie Oldfield, member.
Right. Let's see. Cheryl, Maggie, Sean, can you guys, we still can't hear you. Apologies. For our staff, we have with us Julia. Julia Munster. And on Zoom, Tim.
Tim Zerwinski, Director of Planning and Community Development.
And Josh, I don't know if Josh is with us tonight. Josh is not with us tonight.
Well-needed vacation.
While we are just still working on getting our audio set up from technical assistance, I can begin. Is the audience able to hear us in the room?
Tom?
Tom?
I believe so.
Let's see. Tim, are you able to, you're able to hear us clearly, correct?
Yeah, I'm able to hear us. Folks that are watching on Zoom, if you could like raise your hands if you can hear us.
Right.
Yes, people at home can hear.
All right,
People
great.
at home can hear. And I just heard Cheryl, I think
Thank you.
Yes, I can hear you, Meredith.
that was a delay.
Meredith, can you hear me now? It's Sean.
All right, our NATV people are hard at work. Recording in progress. All right. Like echo. We're still addressing the situation. Thank you. The numbers and can hear each other.
Give him a few minutes, he'll work it out.
We'll get it. And maybe if the members on Zoom could unmute just so we know once there is an audio that we can hear you. Thank you. That's helpful.
Meredith, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Doesn't. Cheryl, did they hear you earlier?
No, I don't think they're hearing us still, Sean.
Okay.
Well, just because it says
You already
18th
had
meeting,
18 meeting.
FY, 2024. I'm just like, I wonder when it ends. That's all.
Do you have what, 5-year, 3-year?
I'm 3. Yeah.
3-year time, so.
I'm coming up in my first year anniversary. I expect a cake.
That's. Muting.
Shut 'em down?
You all my. Test. Test. I think they can hear this. Can you guys hear this
Yes.
on the
Yes.
Zoom?
Yes.
Okay, so we can speak in the mic.
Folks on the Zoom, can you hear this?
Yes.
Can you talk, please?
Yes.
Yes.
Hey.
Yeah.
Good job.
So can you be heard in your microphone?
Can you now hear me speaking? Can those on Zoom now hear me speaking?
I
Yes.
can hear you, Meredith. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Great, great.
There's a little bit of an echo. Meredith, can you say something again?
Yes, we're now able to hear you. There's a slight echo here, which Tom is working on.
Meredith, could you try one more time?
Yes, is that better? That's still. Are any of devices on? No. We're getting closer, folks. Thank you. Hang on. We might have been finding. All right, that's much better. There's still a slight echo, but
Tolerable.
You guys think you can deal with that just for a little while? We'll keep
absolutely,
working on it.
yeah.
Very sorry about this.
No, not at all. All right. Good evening. We've just called the meeting to order. Thank you all and Happy New Year to everyone. The reason I had asked everybody to come to this meeting is following the approval of the ballot initiative by the Select Board. I just wanted the Planning Board to have a chance to gather and talk about the MBTA community zoning in preparation, depending on the outcome of the townwide vote. Breaking it down, we have the discussion of the Planning Board article for annual town meeting. My sense, and I just wanted to hear from the members of the board, is that I would like to see for us to be prepared in the event that the article does get sent back, that we as the planning board are taking the initiative to move forward and have something that we can pass either by May town meeting possibly, or at the fall town meeting, but that we are actively working on this. once we know the outcome, but we are prepared. I would like to hear from the rest of the planning board members on just sort of a strategy, and if this is something that the planning board does want to take up. I think that we have said, previously that we would like to see the district improvements, particularly in East Milton. We're not going to go into any discussion tonight on districts. This is sort of an outline of how we would move forward and what our goals would be as a planning board. I think we would like to see an economic feasibility study. The 10%, which is currently in the article, will ultimately set us back on our affordability numbers going forward. And I think we could very, very easily increase that amount. Number 3, I think we have an opportunity for improved site plan approval process. I believe that we have an opportunity for improved design standards and guidelines. I think many of us would like to see a further detailed economic analysis, a complete build-out analysis, and a traffic study and impacts. And, obviously those would be prioritized as the board saw fit. But I think those are things that we see as possible, things that we could work on, improvements, and just would like to hear from the other board members if the desire is to initiate work on this actively, especially if we would feel the need to submit something for a May town meeting. I think the sooner that we could act on this, the better. And I realize we don't know the outcome until February 17th, but I think taking initiative would be important. So just wanted to gather tonight for a brief meeting to hear what others' thoughts are from other members of the board.
So,
I'll
yeah,
start with Jim, who's here, and we can sort of go around to everybody.
so I couldn't agree more. I think that affordability for me is a big one, and I think 10% isn't going to get it done. So getting that feasibility study is huge. I think if the citizens petition goes, even if it doesn't pass, I mean, there are 3,000 people that signed a petition that want to see something different. And I think we owe it to them to present something different. And I think we can get it done by May town meeting. I would propose that we set aside specific meetings for MBTA zoning only, whether it's 2 hours a week or whatever we decide on. I think our most productive time was when we met weekly and focused on MBTA zoning. So I would be all for pushing this forward, but I would just like to meet more frequently and specifically for MBTA. That's all.
Right. Anyone who would like to speak next? Sean, you have your hand up, so if you would like to.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I agree that we should do everything we possibly can to be prepared for May town meeting. And before we finish this discussion, I would like to ask Tim just to talk about timeline and the timeline between now and May. We don't have until May town meeting. We have until a date and time that an article would need to be moved along from the planning board. So I think we should just acknowledge whatever that timeline is that we have. But I agree that May town meeting should be the target that we shoot for. And if the board decides to add more meetings in order to accomplish that goal, I will be an attendee, and I will do what I can and do my part so that we have adequate meetings so we accomplish that goal. What you had said earlier, Meredith, I feel really needs attention. Traffic issues, financial concerns. We have yet to hear from any of the town officials that are responsible for budgets. I feel we need their perspective on their budgets and how this might affect them, rather than only RKGs. So I think there's an awful lot that we need to work on. But in short, I'm committed to working with the members to prepare us for Maytown meeting.
Great, thank you, Sean. Cheryl or Maggie, do you want to?
Yeah, I can go if you don't mind. Sorry, I'll be short. I have a cough, so I won't go into great length. But I do support everything that's been stated. As I said at town meeting, that I think we should we should finish what we started. And I'd love that opportunity. One of the issues I've had is I wasn't sure if the public, enough of the public knew about it. And I think with this ballot initiative, I think more people are being made aware. I don't think that they know all the details yet. But I think it's a great opportunity for more public engagement and outreach. So I do fully support working on something for May. Thank you.
Cheryl, your thoughts?
Yes. I think it's really ambitious, the checklist or that you laid out, Meredith, to get that ready for May town meeting when the warrant closes on January 17th. And much of what is outlined there would require some outside expertise. So we would need a scope of work and a budget and some approval of that budget. And so I think, so that's one of my concerns. The second concern is we lacked consensus leading up to town meeting on what our goals are. You know, are we looking to develop zoning that's compliant with HLC's guidelines? So until we sort of really, I think, become definitive about what our goals are, I think we could end up just doing more analysis and talking and not get to a consensus again. And whether that's for May or whether that's for the fall or
Cheryl is
Cheryl, you
having
just
some
froze.
Wi-Fi connection issues. She said that earlier, so
Yeah.
we're
I
seeing
know,
that.
it seems- So I do hear what Cheryl is saying, and that's somewhat why I see a priority of the district improvements, because I think that is sort of the foundation on what everything is built on. We really can't do an economic feasibility study until we have that finalized. And if we want to make changes, even to the select board's article, if we wanted to make recommendations, a feasibility study should be based on if there are any district changes, what those are. Because I think we really do have to get those districts in place. Cheryl, to your answer on HLC, my feeling is I think we have to look at everything right now. I think we have to look at what HLC's guidelines, what that would look like. I think it would be really important. I don't think our residents can properly weigh in until they really see a build-out analysis of what that means, a fiscal analysis of what that means. So I am all for mapping out what that would look like, a 25%. And then I think we should listen to the residents on what they ultimately want to see and what they think is best for Milton. But I think we should explore all options, including looking at what that a 25% number, and if that's something that works for Milton. You know, I think many of us, I don't want to speak for the board, but I think the idea that we've been, you know, sort of tied into a numbers game without saying what is really best for Milton. Maybe those two can come together. Maybe the numbers can work and what is best for Milton can work. But I think until we fully have an analysis of this, And we give the residents confidence that we have design guidelines which will protect what is built. I think many people, it's not the concern of that something will be built, it's what will this look like? What will this look like? How will this affect my community? And they want to see that a full design guidelines and site plan approval to make sure that there is a good and healthy process. And then, maybe that's where the consensus can come together, that we can meet HLC's guidelines, but maybe the residents won't feel that that is the best thing for the town. And ultimately, I think that's what we need to listen to the residents in Milton. So
Meredith,
So,
you're
with
coming
that,
a little
I just-
quiet for me. I don't know if your microphone is I don't know if that's just me or if anyone else was noticing her volume coming down a little bit.
I noticed it. Yeah, you're right, Tim.
All right, thank you. Cheryl, I'm sorry, I just was filling in until you were able to get back to finish. Still frozen? It might be the way. Is that better, speaking into the mic this way? Yeah, they said it was a little.
And Meredith's mic is really soft.
I'll try to speak more clearly. Is that
That's-
better?
Very good.
Okay. Were you able to catch everything I said, or should I repeat some you were able to hear? Just soft. Okay.
Yeah, but now we can't see you again. We've still got Sean on the and now me.
All right. Yeah, Cheryl might be coming back.
I think that's a local issue for Cheryl.
Yep.
Everyone else is coming through fine.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think her internet was a little spotty. Well,
Just to while
Yeah,
we're
Tim, go
kind of
ahead.
sorting things out, to
Yeah.
get to Sean's question about a timeline. My conversations with the town administrator so far, I think my understanding is, obviously, we won't have something ready for the 17th in terms of, a full set of language. I think the select board's position, and they'll have a little bit more time to discuss this next week in terms of maybe a little bit more direct kind of specific guidance. But just, understanding, like, yes, the planning board intends to submit an article, so there will be space on the warrant for a planning board article. I think the select board would be interested in understanding a little bit more about when or how long you think it'll take. So Sean, I can definitely, send that question back to them in terms of, what is a kind of, a drop dead date. But I think the board should start to try to come to a little bit of an understanding of, what does our timeline look like, and how long do we think this is going to take? And hopefully those dates are the same. But I can kick that up to the town administrator and see if there's a calendar date where we would absolutely need to have language done.
That'd be great. Thank you, Tim. And we do have meetings between now and the 13th. I think we should be prepared for either outcome. Jim had spoken earlier. If the outcome is that the article stands as it was passed in town meeting, if there's interest in, and there's been, I think, plenty of invitations from many to adjust the article for anything that the planning board might not, see as appropriate. Or if the petition, if the vote votes no on it, we should be ready to go. And between now and the 13th, I think as a board, we need to prepare ourselves to be ready to go and not have any lost time from the 13th through the period of town meeting.
Great. So this may move us into our next agenda item, because we can talk about if our focus is initially going to be on the district improvements, specifically the Granite Ave parcels. Tim, Could you sort of walk us through the compliance model and how we can most efficiently sort of look at that district and look at where we could possibly take units off of Granite Ave and look at alternative sites for that?
Yeah, and this is you know, I had gotten a request from Maggie that I sent along to Meredith, you know, just kind of asking about, you know, what is our internal capacity to be able to kind of work the compliance model on our own, you know, without having to go outside for technical assistance. And you know, just to sort of preface this, you know, we've been working with UTIL from the start. They are, if the board is interested, they are willing and eager to extend their contracts to continue to assist the board with compliance modeling. You know, they've been with us from the start. They've got a lot of familiarity with what we're working on. The sort of the short answer to the question is, we don't currently have the internal capacity to, you know, effectively do the work that UTIL has been doing for us, for a few reasons. The compliance model is in some ways kind of relatively straightforward. You input numbers into a spreadsheet, the calculations happen in the background, they spit out outputs. The relationship of all of the different inputs to all of the various outputs is something that we have a bit of an understanding of, but not nearly as much as the folks that have been running these models for us dozens of times and for other communities dozens of times. And so the thing that I would say is, and I'm going to share my screen real quick just to kind of show you what I'm thinking. You know, there's definitely we definitely have the capability to sort of can everyone see the spreadsheet up here?
Yes.
So this is just, I'm bringing up the two sort of Milton Station mandatory mixed use districts. This is the sort of the output summary, you know, for each of them. And it's got, you know, the unit capacity and it shows the acreage and everything. This is the answer. And sort of, you know, the inputs go in some of these other kind of, you know, tabs down here. So just to kind of show you really quickly how it works, I just want you to remember this Milton Station West final unit capacity number of 118. You know, because what we're going to try to do is go in and manipulate different parameters to change that number. And so it's you know, it's relatively, you know, simple. This is the checklist parameters. This is all the inputs. You know, I won't kind of linger on any of these, but it's, you know, building types, lot sizes, restrictions on building volume. So here's a good example. In the Milton Station West district, you know, we have a building height of 3.5 right now in this. And so if I change this to 10, we can go and look and see what that does to that number of 118 that we saw earlier. So it's still at 118, all right? And what that means is that there is another parameter that is in this model that is limiting what that final unit capacity figure is. If you go from 3.5 stories to 10 stories, you would think that there would be an increase in the number of units. But there's another limiting factor in there. And so we can go in and figure that out. I'm not going to do it right now, but I do kind of want to find a number that'll change that. We've got FAR of 1. You know, if we change that to 5, what does that do for us? Still at 118, right? So again, there's a number here that is limiting the number of units that could potentially be built here, beyond the massive height and massive FAR that we've inputted. I suspect that it's a units per acre figure, which is all the way down here. Maximum dwelling units per acre. You know, if we change that to 100. All right, now we're cooking. All right, now the unit capacity has gone up from 118 to 294. So that's just a really kind of quick example of there's all these different parameters that you can change. And, you know, obviously we don't want 10-story buildings and we don't want an FAR of 5 and we don't want to have 100 units per acre. So, you know, you sort of set those at what you want and you see what happens. And it's a sort of a really sort of, you know, for every iteration that we saw, you know, from UTIL at a meeting, at their desks, you know, before the meeting, they were doing this dozens, hundreds of times of inputting numbers, checking the outputs, you know, calibrating those outputs. So that's something where you know, it's not hard, and you can kind of get the hang of it, but it is very labor intensive. And so sort of having an understanding of what is going to affect outcomes versus what is not going to affect outcomes is something that, again, we have a basic knowledge of and can figure it out, but not nearly as easily and effectively as the folks at the consultants do. And the other thing is, and again, this is something that, you know, we could potentially develop the in-house capacity to do this, but it would take a lot of time and a lot of effort. And again, we would sort of be starting from scratch in a way that, you know, UTIL would not, is actually inputting the geographies. So District 1 and District 2, Milton Station West, Milton Station East, those are populated here. These tabs, District 1 and District 2, actually have the parcel information and the GIS data for these. So you can see sort of at the bottom of the screen here, this is all of the parcel data from the state's GIS data for all of the parcels that are in this sub-district. This one might have a few, actually not as many. There's only 4 parcels in this one, but you can kind of see as I go to the right, you know, address, owner, description, acreage, you know, and it's got all of these other sort of things. This is pulled from a GIS database that at our staff level, we don't have the expertise to sort of be manipulating this. We would need to kind of work and kind of train up the town's GIS staff and work with them. And that becomes a situation where we are entering the workflow of, you know, the GIS folks that are working for the entire town for every department. And so it's not as simple as, you know, we want to change geography, you know, we got to kind of get in line with the GIS department in a way that, you know, obviously there is some lag time when you're talking with your consultant. But again, they can do this relatively easily, you know, at a moment's kind of request in a way that, you know, us figuring out how to work this thing and then, you know, training our own GIS staff to do it. So, you know, the thing that I would say is, figuring out the geographies is one of the first steps, or at least the potential geographies. And we've tested a bunch. You know, we've got them in compliance model sheets, you know, somewhere. But if there are, you know, geographies that the board wants to look at, that is something that, you know, we should get into the hands of the consultants relatively early on so that we get these compliance model sheets, and then it becomes a little bit more of a straightforward exercise of, okay, what does this look like at 5 stories? What does this look like at 35 units per acre? You know, that's something where, you know, you would still want to sort of run those numbers by the consultant, again, because, you know, they have a little bit more of an expansive knowledge of how these numbers are affecting each other and you know, how they're actually, you know, what really becomes important is, you know, how is this actually affecting the compliance thresholds that you need to hit? But, you know, we do have the capability to sort of make a little bit more educated and specific requests for information changes, et cetera, you know, by directly manipulating the model itself. But I would still recommend keeping UTIL on board, you know, because again, they can do it much quicker. They can do it much more comprehensively, you know, because they've just got a lot more experience than we do. So happy to field any more questions about that, but that was just kind of like a basic, you know, we can manipulate some things. I wouldn't count on the work that we do as a staff. I would rather count on the work that the consultants do.
That's great, Tim. That's very helpful. Sean, you had your hand up, and then Maggie raised her second.
Okay, I don't want to derail us from a subject matter, though. I do have a couple of questions I wanted to put forth to Tim. So at an appropriate time, I'll ask the questions. If we're transitioning to another topic, then this is fine. So you tell me, Meredith.
All right, then why don't we go to Maggie, if it's pertaining to what we're talking about with the model?
Yes, I'd like to talk about the compliance model, but actually Cheryl had her hand up first. So if she wanted to talk about it, then she should go before I go.
Cheryl, welcome back. We can't see you, I'm sorry.
Meredith, can I just ask if you see me, Meredith?
We cannot see you.
Yeah, I turned my video off in the attempt to make this work on my phone.
Now I
Meredith?
can hear you. Yes, thank you, Cheryl. Go ahead.
Okay,
Yep.
I'm sorry. I turned my video off because I think it works better with the Wi-Fi that I have right now, and off of my phone. I did. I don't know where I cut out before, but do you mind if I just make one statement and then talk about the compliance model?
Absolutely, Cheryl. Yes, please go ahead. You were discussing
Hello,
the
can you hear me?
challenges of.
Yeah, okay.
It's a little
Yeah,
hard to
so I
hear you,
just
but
wanted
if you can
to,
speak up.
as I said, I think it's, all right, let me turn my volume up and see if that helps. All right, can you hear me better now?
That's a little better.
Can you hear me better now? Okay. What I wanted to say, can you hear me better? All right. So I think it's best for the residents that we've talked about who are interested in what we would do is to set clear goals. Can you hear that?
Yes, you broke up a little bit, but.
Hello, Meredith, did you hear that?
Yes.
You
Yes,
could hear
we
me.
did.
You could hear me? Okay. So what I think is important is to set clear goals so that the residents know, yeah, okay, so you heard that part. And then maybe weren't following along through this entire process to look at the compliance models that Tim mentioned that we looked at and some that we decided not to move forward with. And one way I think that we could begin is to sort of have a summary, maybe Util does it, maybe Tim does it, of all of the districts that we've looked at and what we found as challenges with those districts or what we found as benefits with those districts, and do what I would call a district option scorecard. And we would put the criteria by which we wanted to score each district. And we could do it in a weighted way. So some criteria would get weighted more than other criteria. So for example, within a half mile of a transit station might get one numerical number versus something that already has multifamily housing on it or an undeveloped parcel. You know, we could start with all the criteria by which we want to measure these districts. And then people can understand how at least some of the districts that are agreed upon, I think by many people, even on the board, were arrived at. And then when we're looking at which we might study further, we have an objective set of criteria to work against.
Mm-hmm. Those cons, our list of why we prefer that area or why we, our concerns with those locations. And trying to be as efficient as possible. But Tim.
Yeah. So
yeah,
I guess the first
having
thing,
criteria on why we selected what we did or why we would like to look at alternative sites.
Right. So what criteria will we measure a new site by? Right. What criteria can we assign to the sites that we currently have? I mean districts. So that's, I think, a good starting point. in thinking about districts. I also think it would be really, that could also be a way to make it clear to residents what our priorities are, and they could provide feedback on those priorities.
How do the other members feel about that?
So- sorry.
That's right.
So to talk about the whole compliance model as a whole, I've sort of felt like, we were never given the opportunity to play around personally with the compliance model. We were always dependent on UTO, as an outside consultant. And so I feel like it would be helpful if we were, given, the model, what Tim just showed, you know, we should all be provided it, and maybe even the residents. And then, UTL could give us their work product. You know, technically, it's the town of Milton's work product. And so then we can, to Cheryl's point, is kind of play around with it. The residents can see how, it affects, their neighborhoods. And, I do, agree with Cheryl about the, guiding principles. I know we started with 7 guiding principles, and, you know, part of the problem was we worked through these, the 7 guiding principles were all part of the compliance model, but we didn't really see the results of the work, until the very end. And so, when the results were given, many residents didn't like what they saw. And then we never had the opportunity to go back and, you know, prioritize the guiding principles. So, you know, it's, you sometimes can't always get what you want. And so we should probably prioritize them. And then, you know, stick it into the compliance model. So I just think that we should have the opportunity to understand the variables of the model. You know, zoning is supposed to make sense. And to me personally, that the zoning that the compliance model came up with doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I would just like the opportunity, and I think some other residents would too, is to personally go through the compliance model and kind of play around with it. And I thought it was helpful to see on the screen, Tim, that, you know, it was a different color background in the cells. So we would be able to see what numbers we can play around with. And we can even go sort of property by property, because to Cheryl's point, there are a lot of, I think, properties that we are, in agreement about, and we have a consensus, about. And I think it's easier to kind of start, with those ones that we have an agreement with.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think to Maggie's point, you know, this is perfectly doable, and Maggie, at various points, I have sent along. I mean, we've gone through versions upon versions upon versions of this stuff. So, you know, you've at least gotten one version of the model. It may be outdated, almost as soon as I sent it, but the trick of this is the kind of the labor intensive part is populating that worksheet with the district geographies, right? That's the thing that you can't really you can't manipulate that and fiddle with that as much as you can with the numbers, because that's, you know, an import of data from one database into the compliance model database. And so, you know, in order, you know, but after that is done, I mean, we could have UTL, you know, generate, you know, any number of sheets that have, you know, all of the geographies that you're talking about. And one, I'm going to share my screen again just to show you kind of one more kind of wrinkle in all of this. And that is, you know, you'll notice that, you know, in the summary, you know, this sheet in particular only has Milton Station West and Milton Station East in it, right? And the reason for that is the way that the model is kind of built is you can see District 1, District 2, District 3, District 4, District 5, there's only space for 5, these would be sub-districts. And so when we talk about the compliance model, what we're actually talking about is 3 or even 4 of these worksheets that, you have to then kind of add everything up in order to get your total unit capacity and divide by, the total kind of, so, there's a way in which, coming up with the final numbers is actually a little bit more of an exercise than just kind of plugging things into here. But I think, for the purposes of the board doing its work, I don't think you actually need that. I think what you need is to identify what the geographies are, and some of them may stay the same, some of them may be different, some of them may be new, some of them may be bigger, some of them may be smaller, but decide on kind of that collection of sub-districts that you want to look at, and then figure out on a district by district basis, what you think works. And then you can, at the end of that exercise, see, does this comply or does this not? And how do we get it to comply? And what are the trade-offs we need to make? But I do think that sort of, the order of operations here is, the board needs to come up with a sort of grand collection of sub-districts that it wants to consider, so that UTIL can then go do the work of populating these sheets, and then you could kind of be off to the races in terms of manipulating some of those parameters.
Okay.
Yeah, and I kind of thought that, sorry, just to finish, I kind of thought that, Tim, it seemed to me in my head that looking at each property kind of separately as a special permit process. So like we know, for instance, take 88 Wharf. We're all comfortable with 88 Wharf, I think. Well, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think that's a comfortable building. We're used to it. We accept it. And where else in town could we use that or put an 88 Wharf? And then we, kind of identify a neighborhood in which we might be comfortable. And then we kind of, to your point, do a collection of those. Or if we're comfortable with the ice house, the way the ice house looks, where can we put that somewhere else? So then, to your point, we get a collection of properties and then assemble them together.
Was that it, Maggie? Okay. Okay, thank you. Sean,
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. Tim, could you, is it possible to show us on that compliance model that you just had up, the Excel sheet, is it possible to show us where the geography is within that? How does where does it fit in? Is it a particular cell? Does it fit in by, I'm curious more than anything else.
Yeah, so the way the way it works is, and I'll share my screen again, is, and this is, I mean, this is, I literally don't know how to do this. I would have to figure it out. I've just always asked UTL to do it. It's in these cells down here, the district cells, where if you work with GIS, sort of the back end of, the front end of a GIS is a map and it shows, what you want it to show. The back end of it is effectively an Excel sheet with rows and columns. And this is where all of that gets copy and pasted from. The town and the state have have a kind of symbiotic relationship in terms of providing GIS data to each other. I believe this comes from the state's GIS database, but that's informed by our own assessing and GIS departments. But this literally gets copy and pasted. So like you say, this is, I forget which one this is. This is 131. So this is Milton Station West, right? So this is like the Central Ave Business District, 131 Elliott, 36 Central. You can see these addresses here. So, what we would do is, you'd look at a map and you say, this is a district that we'd want to look at. And you sort of, draw, a line around it. And then you can then in the GIS collect all of those parcels. And, and like I said, in the front end, it's a map. You're kind of highlighting all of these parcels. On the back end, it's grabbing all of this data in all of these columns. Like again, address, owner, all of the dimensional stuff that's in here. And then
So I think what I'm understanding, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think I might be able to draw this to a quick conclusion. They use those addresses to create a boundary,
Yes.
create a boundary of the geography.
Yeah,
Okay.
the boundary is the parcels, right?
Understood.
So it's
Yeah.
a pile of parcels and they're all contiguous and that forms the district. Yeah.
And they have to use, and this only makes sense, they have to use an address which will correlate to an ID number in the GIS models that create the boundary.
Yeah, I mean, technically everything has this second column is the loc ID column. This is effectively the state parcel ID.
Yes.
Our assessing data has its own system of parcel IDs, but every parcel has an ID. In a way that not every parcel necessarily has an address. We've got a bunch of 0 central abs out there. Anything that doesn't have a street address definitely has a loc ID. So that's kind of how it's kind of it's pegged to that more than the address. But we understand it as addresses. When you look at the map and you sort of draw that line around whatever your district's going to be.
I understand. Okay, that's great. That's helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Question?
Yeah.
Tim, could I jump in for a quick question about UTIL? If we end up using them, which it looks like we probably would, one of the problems I had with them is that we would give them different parameters. They would do their thing and come back in a week or two with answers. Is there any way to speed that turnaround time up with them?
I can't say. My instinct here is no. It does take a certain amount of time, to kind of implement feedback. And obviously they have, other clients that they're kind of, working with. Which I think is why it's important to do the thinking, as much thinking ahead of time in terms of, what do we need UTIL to do versus what can we kind of start to figure out on our own, so that rather than, hey, let's try this, and then 2 weeks later UTIL comes back and it's like, yeah, we don't like this, let's try this, to be able to have a few more tools in our hands, to be able to kind of give, I don't want to say more educated feedback, because I think the feedback that the board's been given has definitely been educated, but more potent and specific feedback that the consultants can then kind of move the ball forward more in that kind of lag time between meetings. And so again, I think figuring out what is the grand collection of sub-districts that are kind of on the table, so that we can get compliance model documents that we can kind of again test out different parameters on our own. This is stuff that we'd want them to verify, but at least we can say, hey, look, we tried this sub-district and we ran through every possible type of dimension. It didn't work for us. Let's get rid of it. So, short answer, I don't think there's a way to speed up the process, but I do think that there's a way to give the consultants better, richer, more robust feedback, so that what gets accomplished in that lag time is more productive.
Yeah, and that's, Tim, exactly my point, why I kind of want to get this personally, get the compliance model, because at one of our meetings, one of the consultants was able to change it during the meeting. And so I would think that to help speed the process up, if we all individually kind of played around with it, we could see or come up with scenarios that we're comfortable with. And then we don't have to wait the 2 weeks, because what if I came up with something, and I asked the consultants to do it like I did, and then came back, we weren't, satisfied with it, then we do have a waste of time. And then people say, oh, you're wasting time. But so that's why I kind of want to have the ability to kind of play around with the compliance model and change things. I'm fortunate just right now, I've got some time on my hands, so I have time to do it. it would be great if you could share it with all of us. Thanks.
Yeah, and what I can do is, and the thing that I just brought up just now is literally the compliance model that's associated with Article 1. So that's what we've got right now. I can send that out to the board. Again, you may be interested in other sub-districts, in which case we would need to identify those and kind of get those populated into a model. But for the time being, working with what we've got, I can certainly, and I'll make a note to send that out, with the materials for next week's meeting. Whether or not you talk about it next week, it'll be in your folders. So we can certainly do that.
That's great, Tim. Thank you. And Cheryl is now with us in person. So welcome, Cheryl. She's escaped the technical.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you nice and clear. So welcome.
Sorry about that, everyone.
Yeah.
There is echo still.
I'll move. There is a little bit.
Okay.
I'm
Maybe
separating over here a little bit.
Maybe that won't
Is that
help.
better?
Okay. I understand I broke up a bit, but did you all hear me enough what my suggestions were
Yes.
about having
We did.
a scorecard? Okay,
We
great.
did.
So maybe one suggestion that I would have on that is maybe, and Maggie, you referred to as sort of our guiding principles, and I think that's what you were alluding to. Maybe, Tim, perhaps we send our list of what our criteria, what we were basing decisions on, send a list to you that you could maybe put something together that when we go back and maybe look at the current districts that exist, use those as, a rating system on those and sort of go through that together.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking is we could start with sort of positive, neutral, not positive, and then we could then start to weight them, which was, I think Maggie was saying prioritize, but you can also just kind of give it different weight.
Right.
I was looking at an evaluation of a different kind of citing, and they did this weighted system, and it came up with a total number, which I thought was as someone who wasn't involved in the process, who read the report, it was very clear and to understand, how they made their choice. So I think for residents, if they didn't watch 28 meetings, they might have missed how some things were decided. And it's still important information for, I think, everyone to understand how some districts, if the size changes the density, which changes the compliance and all of these things. So if we kind of go through again, what, not just the goals of no tear downs or no historic districts or things like that, but also, minimum of 5-acre districts and other parameters that have been used. So even if somebody suggests a district that's not 5 acres, then it would, in the scoring system, it would be not compliant with guidelines, right? But at least you're keeping track of it, and it's not something where it's discussed and said, well, that doesn't work, so we're not going to go forward, right? Because then it's like we come back and we say, well, we looked at that, but can we refresh our memories why we looked at that? And it didn't work. This tracking system, I think, will be a way to keep for us to refer back to it and kind of refresh our memories and be a good guide for others who haven't been involved in all the meetings, to understand.
So should that be something that we go through district by district, and then we have a sort of an evaluation system as we go through each of what currently exists? I'm trying to think of efficiency as well as,
Yeah, certainly the
really
existing
making sure.
districts should be put into that, and then any new ones, or any that we already did and that we didn't proceed with because there were things about them that we felt weren't working well. Put all 30 or however many it was. I know there's 30 iterations, but there might not be 30 sub-districts. Put them all in, and but the first grouping should be the ones that are in what town meeting approved, right? And then we can identify which ones we think there's agreement on, which ones we think needs improvement or further study, and which might need to be reconsidered.
or new ones that haven't been done.
How does that sound to everybody, sort of going through that? So that would possibly be for that district evaluation. Would people be able to meet? I don't think we're gonna have time on the 11th, so I would recommend scheduling a separate meeting that we could sort of, maybe Tim could send out all those iterations that we've gone through, and people can sort of look at them and see what we would want to go back and revisit, possibly what ones that we have not explored, and be able to give some criteria to each of those evaluations.
So if Tim has time and staff has time to put a map with this scorecard, the map from UTIL, I think then if you could, list them, however you want to number them, and then tie that numbering back to the map. Again, another just sort of efficient way to understand it. It's really just about pulling it. Before town meeting, I looked at all of the prior iterations that we got from the consultants, not just UTIL. We had MAPC also did a piece. And but it's hard to kind of put, you're flipping back and forth with a lot of different material, and it's material that we're familiar with. So you think about the average person who's not as familiar, it's a lot to dig through. So I think it's kind of the summary document would really be useful for everyone, but a useful starting point for thinking about change too.
Sean, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Yes, Meredith. Cheryl, you're describing a scorecard. Can you elaborate on how a scorecard and how a score would be created?
Well, I think we'd have to first decide. Let's just say, I'm going to use one example. Is it within a half a mile of transit trolley? Is it within a half a mile of bus? And you could say, well, I'm just giving this as an example. I haven't made, any decisions, but because the guidelines and the law say a half mile, you could weight that differently than the bus, for example, right? And if you had access to neither of those, then that would get a different score. So you could just say, let's say the score is 1, 2, 3. So it's not just check or minus or neutral. So that's just one example. Some of them may not work in a numerical fashion like that. So maybe it's just a 1 for everything. So like, let's say it's single family zoning already, or it's multifamily zoning already, or it's mixed use. Things, it's a historic district, so you would get, maybe you get a -1 if it's a historic district, you're taking points away. That's the idea, Sean?
My only concern is the scoring might end up being something that's arbitrary, and it may take us time to figure out a scoring model.
So maybe we start with whether it's close to the trolley or not. You can either say yes or no, right? Or check or X. You could say it's a historic district or not, or historic building or not. Others might not be as clear as that. And maybe it's something where it takes a footnote or a note on the side. Again, this report that I read did have notes on the side in a more detailed appendix, but I think if we just look at what we think are the decision-making criteria, we can see how complicated it might get.
No, I think that's a good idea. And I think it also gives us a chance as we go through this evaluation to consider what the residents have said. At this point, it would be irresponsible of us to not recognize what the folks that live in the Granite Ave neighborhood have said about how they feel about that particular zoning. So this analysis, I think, is excellent. And maybe we can create a scoring model, Cheryl, like you suggest, but at a minimum, I think it's an opportunity for us to consider what we've heard.
Well, the other thing I think could be an opportunity to say additional information is needed in order to be able to rank this one. And you might say a traffic study is one, or you might say something else, is the other information that's necessary. So,
My
And-
only caution on the, Cheryl, I apologize for interrupting. My only caution on the scoring system is if we can come up with something that is simple and not too complicated and something that's not going to be debated, if it's a 1 to you, would it be a 1 to everybody else? Or, you know what I'm saying? That's the only concern I have, is that we might not have something that's uniform in terms of our ability to apply it.
yeah, so maybe if we have the list next week or when we talk about it next, our next meeting on this discussion, we can look through what everybody, certainly I think the starting point is what Tim has provided and what he presented. But, we can add to that, we can review the list. Then think about, we can discuss each one. Do we think this is something that can be rated easily or not? And maybe some of them get separated out and they don't get a rating. I haven't looked at each one, Sean, to think through each one, so I'm just suggesting that we all sort of think about it for
Sure.
our next meeting.
Meredith, if you don't mind, I would like to ask a couple of questions.
Absolutely.
Tim, one of the concerns I think that many have spoken of is traffic. And, obviously, there's been a lot of conversation about Granite Ave, including me making statements about Granite Ave and the vehicles that we're going to add to Granite Ave. But no matter where it is, traffic is a part of this. And probably nowhere better illustrated than RKG's analysis, which I think says that we would derive 1.3 million in excise tax. The only way you're going to get that is if we have new cars on the road. So we haven't really spent any time, talking about traffic. My question is, I don't know a lot about our traffic commission that we have in town, but we're fortunate to have people that are working hard on traffic issues. Do they have a consultant that works for the traffic commission?
So we do have a contract with Beta Group, which is a transportation engineering and planning consultancy, that they administer our townwide traffic model. So when there are projects that we want to evaluate, they run that for us. They also do various kind of design and engineering concepts for us at either the behest of the traffic commission or the select board. Part of that, and I would have to, so to answer your question, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is, depending on the type of work that we're asking them to do, there's engineering work and design work is not subject to Chapter 30B procurement rules. So you can just pick an engineering firm and they can do an engineering design for you. Planning work is not exempt from 30B. So that would be a situation where, depending on the type of study and the type of analysis, we may need to procure those services if we wanted to sort of do them. That being said, our relationship with Beta is such that, if we were to ask them, like, look, what would an analysis have to look like? What would a scope of work look like for this sort of thing? I'm almost certain that they would assist us in that. I think the question about, and this was, a little bit of a frustrating thing around town meeting, because there just wasn't an opportunity to kind of go in depth on this, is, we're accustomed, and you all are accustomed as a board, to sort of evaluating traffic studies for these sort of individual development projects. So, we looked at 440 Granite Ave, and we're looking at 111 Highland Street. These are discrete projects, and we know how big they are, and we know when they're coming soon, if the board approves them. And so we have that data, and we can do that modeling. With zoning, it's a little bit different, because you don't know where, when, and how much is going to get built. And so you have to sort of, in the example of a development project, the applicant is kind of planting that flag for you. We're going to be building a 70-bed facility on this street, and this is how many people are going to live there. With zoning, you need to kind of make an assumption yourself and say, we're going to assume that in this time frame, this many units are going to be built, or this much development is going to happen, and it's going to happen in these locations. Because you can't just, you can't just ask the transportation, engineer to say, model, the full build out in 10 years, because I think, it's not reasonable to assume that'll happen. So before we even get to the, and this is all to say that, like, if you give the inputs to the model, you can analyze anything. But the issue for the board is those inputs of, how many units do we assume are going to happen? When do we assume they're going to happen? And where do we assume they're going to happen? You all are going to have to kind of come up with that, to kind of feed to the consultant. So I think that's one thing where, Sean, you mentioned the RKG analysis. They make a certain amount of assumptions on excise tax. We could probably ask them, how'd you get that? How'd you back into that number? But they also make, based on, real estate economics and their understanding of kind of the development industry as it exists today, what is the sort of reasonable expectation for how many units? So I think, figuring out what that number is and where that number is going to be important for an analysis, because you can do the analysis, but it's got to be kind of based in something. Does that make sense? I was talking a lot there. I'm sorry.
I understand. I
Can I
understand.
just add one piece of information to what Tim said, to
Of
your
course.
question about the traffic? Beta Group developed a traffic model. It's like a simulation kind of model. And they concentrated initially in East Milton Square. And the idea about that is you can plug in information and see what the impact would be through that model. So it's not just words on a piece of paper, but it's actually, data that's computed through that model. And so that could be a tool that could be utilized in this, I think. That was the idea behind developing it, is to be able to evaluate projects impact in an aggregate way, because sometimes, you get a traffic study and it's just one project, and they're asked to consider other projects, but they may not have all that information. And the other thing I wanted to mention about the traffic and that end RKG is in what they were looking at in terms of the probability of build out was based on the current assessed value, so what the current uses are. So I know a lot of people have looked at, well, Granite Ave was identified first, and it's in part, and I asked this at the meeting when the fellow from RKG was here, was that because there's no tax paid by a state entity, that's shown as 0 as your starting point. So anything that starts at 0, a new development's going to bring in more taxes. So that rises to the top. But the reality is there's a different process since it's state-owned land for procurement. So you'd have to really kind of, I think, look at the assumptions of when the timing, because their model was based on a build out over time, which seems to me would be the starting point for looking at the traffic, right? So if their build out was saying, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but let's just say it's 100 units in year 1 to 5, then you could use that for your traffic analysis. If it was 200 units in year 5 to 10, and that's, I think, could be the basis of the traffic analysis.
We're speculating just like.
Well, that's actually not there. I'm sorry. Their analysis is not built out as you suggested. Their analysis is not built out over time. They have no timeline. That's not how their information is presented in their report.
That's my recollection from the presentation. So
Yeah, I happen to be looking at it as we're speaking, but they didn't have an ability to prepare a model that would be built out over time. But
That's something that we would definitely want to look at.
Well, with regard to traffic, I think I'll go back to where I started. I do think we have to somehow put our best effort in to determining what impacts might be. Now, Granite Ave is an example. I think it's very hard. Let me go back over maybe to the Elliott Street corridor. Very hard to determine over time how development may occur over there on Elliott Street. Probably a little easier to understand how development might happen on Granite Ave. And maybe you could just assume, I have said this before, assume Granite Ave develops in 5 years, or assume it develops in 7 years, and calculate whatever vehicles you would have on Granite Ave in that period of time. Ask the consultant to consider that data, or East Milton, 423 units in East Milton. Over what period of time might that be? So maybe it's 10 years. In 10 years, the town would have X number more vehicles on the road. So I feel like we're not far enough along in so many of these areas for anybody to be able to say, we absolutely know how this is going to affect Milton. And I feel like we have to work very hard to advance in all of these areas, and traffic happens to be one of them.
And I agree. And I go back to the districts being the foundation for all of this, because until we get those, real recommendations and finalized, if we decide to take off, we would recommend removing Granite Ave as one of the districts. We don't need to study that. So I do want to make that sort of our focus. And I want to make sure we're clear on what we're asking of Tim as a town planner and the planning staff. Are we asking them to come back, start with our current districts, and then have an evaluation system tied to those maps, and then possibly ask the planning board members if there are any other districts that you would like to go back and revisit, that you would like to reconsider, or other areas that we look at those. Does that sound like a?
I still think it would be helpful to have the districts that were studied by MAPC in Newtown. Fuller Village, for example, Randolph Ave. I think possibly Quistit Brook or Winter Valley was, I'm not remembering exactly each one, but the main districts. And there is a district that was in the first presentation that Tim provided us in October of 22 on Randolph Ave that encompassed where Newcomb Farms is. It crossed Randolph Ave and picked up some other properties across the street. I'm not remembering each.
Was it the Pepsi plant? I don't know what the Pepsi plant being
It was an initial, yeah, so it was in an initial presentation. So this is why.
A. Thomas, it was
Yeah,
A. Thomas
A.
Nursery.
Thomas, okay. No, there was, Thomas got studied, and the horse farm and the 40B got studied, but there was an initial site earlier that it didn't get studied because in looking at that, I called Tim and asked him if UTIL or MAPC had looked at that particular one, and they hadn't. So I just think it's useful to get the sites that were kind of first identified and just do a review of them before because we might suggest them again, and it would be best just to go through the review first.
That seems
Yeah,
reasonable.
to the extent that we have, and I may need to get them from MAPC and UTL, but those are gettable. To the extent that we have compliance model sheets with all of those sub-districts in them, I will send those to the board and kind of very clearly identify. When I do send those out and you start to kind of goof around with them, you know what I mean. Work very hard and purposefully on them. One thing I want everyone to kind of just be like super clear about is, because we're looking at, districts on a discrete level, you'll go in and you'll do, every sub-district will be identified by a district number, District 1, Milton Station West, District 2, Milton Station East in this case. You're gonna be looking at these on a kind of individual discrete basis, because sometimes these are kind of based on older iterations, older combinations of sub-districts. So as you go in there and kind of manipulate this information, you really need to just be focusing on, if I did something in District 1, I'm only looking at District 1 and what the implications are on that for, unit capacity per district, dwelling units per acre, et cetera. Because depending on, in this case, we've got 2 sub-districts in this sheet that have different parameters kind of based on them. And then you get like a summary total on the far right side. That's not going to be meaningful for this exercise, because we're potentially testing combinations of sub-districts that we actually don't want to be testing this combination, but we want to look at, this one particular one. So until we get to a point where, you have an established collection of sub-districts in one sheet or one set of sheets, just look at them on an individual level. And I'll kind of remind folks, of that, when I send out the email. But just because, the model is built not just to do that, but to also sum up and average, all the data that you're kind of generating. And we're not necessarily interested in that. We're trying to look at them on an individual basis here.
Mhm.
Yeah, and Tim, just as a question, remind me if we actually went through the modeling when MAPC was first on the scene. I don't know if we actually saw any of the modeling that UTL did. Did they?
MAPC did do a compliance modeling exercise. I don't know if we got the compliance model sheets from them. I'll have to check my files. They did present to us, a summary of their data. But to the extent that we can get those sheets and kind of send them out, and those have, the Brush Hill Road districts and the Randolph Ave districts, we'll get those out to you. If I don't have them tomorrow, I'll have them next week for sure. But those exist. They wouldn't have been able to generate the data without them. Just whether or not we've got them in our hands or not. I think we might. So I'll double check on that.
Okay, thank you.
That's great. Anyone else on the compliance model? Sean, is your hand up again?
Not on the compliance model. I have a question, I guess, before we get into our last topic, but let me know when we're through the compliance model and I'll ask my question.
I think that was it for now on the compliance model. So go ahead, Sean.
I think one of the responsibilities that we all have, certainly us on the planning board and any other member of our town government, is to provide to the residents accurate information so the residents can I guess render their own opinion based on good information. During the select board meeting on the 28th, there were a few statements that were made that came to my attention when I was listening to, and I wanted to ask Tim for clarification, because I feel like the residents need to understand if some of what was said is actually true. And one statement was, if someone right now wanted to put up a 40B project where the salt sheds are, they could do it. Tim, is that a true statement?
So the salt sheds are currently owned by MassDOT. And so, it's not as simple as, the state is not really in the business of building its own housing. But it is true that if the state did want to dispose of that land for affordable housing development purposes, they could dispose of it to a developer who would more than likely do a 40B project. So it's not as kind of direct as, we'll see an application tomorrow. There would be a disposition process that the state would have to do. But if they were interested in developing affordable housing on not just that site, but any state land, in town, they would be able to do that. And 40B would probably be the mechanism by which they would do it.
I think we all probably are aware that the state could do what the state wants to do on the state's own property. I guess the question that some might have when they hear that is not necessarily whether the state could do something on the state property or not. But are we in safe harbor, or are we not in safe harbor?
We are not currently in safe harbor, because the safe harbor that we had was through our housing production plan. And so the way that you can gain safe harbor through your housing production plan is, you set a housing goal of, it was 48 units approved per year over the course of the plan, kind of, would technically get us towards 40B compliance. And if you approve 48 units in a year, you get a year of safe harbor. If you approve 96 units in a year, you get 2 years of safe harbor. So the first batch of 40B projects that were approved got us to 96 units. So, as of, I forget what date in 2021, we had 2 years of safe harbor. The trouble with that is under the 40B regulations, when a 40B project is approved, those units immediately go on your subsidized housing inventory. That's kind of the trick of 40B. They want you to approve 40B projects. The incentive is they go immediately on the inventory in a way that other units need to actually be built first. The regulations say that within 12 months, if an approved project hasn't pulled a building permit, those units then get pulled off your subsidized housing inventory. And so the dynamic that we saw with our housing production plan and the numerous 40Bs that we approved is, with the exception of the Ice House, none of them have pulled building permits, either for reasons of, going through appeals in Superior or Land Court, or just, they're kind of backburnered by the developer. So we saw a sort of an influx of units onto the inventory, and then 12 months later, all of those units slipped off the inventory, which then takes us out of safe harbor. So we were able to get briefly back into safe harbor because of kind of the second batch of approvals. But that expired back in November. And so, until or unless we approve 48 more units eligible for the subsidized housing inventory, we are no longer in safe harbor.
Who is next in line for a building permit?
It's tough to say. My instinct here is the 582 Blue Hill Ave project. Simply because that's sort of the biggest one that developer has, that is kind of has a clear path, without any appeals. That being said, we already got credit for those units when they were approved, so you can't then get credit again once they've slipped off the inventory. So we would need to approve a new project worth 48 or more units.
And should they all be built, we would, all of those projects, we would meet our requirement?
We would be somewhere between 9.5% and 9.8%. I think we would be anywhere between 25 and 40 units. I'd have to go back and check the calculation, but we would be, if all of those projects, including 711 Randolph Ave, which is kind of not in the mix, but is probably going to be built pretty soon. If all of those get built as they've been applied for, we'll be above 9% and within a project or two of permanent safe harbor at 10%.
And what do you mean not in the mix?
So that it's in the mix in terms of the Supreme Judicial Court said that they were allowed to build it, and so they're allowed to build it. It hasn't been within the calculation of the kind of safe harbor dynamic that we've been talking about, because that one was approved back in 2017, and so any safe harbor that could have been achieved has kind of long been extinguished there. So that's obviously in the mix in terms of anticipated projects that are in the process of getting their building permits, but it's not part of the kind of safe harbor conversation that we've been having over the past 2 or 3 years.
Just jump in there for a moment. Tim, you said permanent safe harbor, but it's really not permanent if new units are added, right? So it's based on.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean permanent in the sense of it's not a temporary safe harbor through the housing production plan, but is a 10% or 1.5% are the, the permanent safe harbors. Obviously, yes, if we were to kind of change that, the other thing is that number that only gets recalculated once every 10 years. And so, it's more durable than the housing production plan safe harbor.
And
Yeah,
just
one of the, go ahead, Cheryl.
Just one other thing, Tim, I had seen, and just for the benefit of the board members and the audience, people at home who may be watching, I had seen that Governor Healy had issued, I think it's a directive or some, I don't know the technical term, but asking every state agency to review their land, their properties, to ascertain whether any could be used for housing and affordable housing. That was in October of 23. So, Tim, are you able to try and find out anything, whether the Mass DOT property is being looked at by DOT?
We can certainly try. I am familiar with that order. My instinct here is that we would we would hear the results when they came out. That's something that I'm sure that the governor would try to trumpet. But we'll try to keep our finger a little bit more closely on the pulse of that. So yeah, we'll definitely look into it.
I guess, Tim, just for the residents of that Cortland Circle area, I just want them to understand a developer cannot come to the town right now and file a 40B project for the salt sheds. That's state-owned land.
Yeah, there's another step in that process. So yeah, the state would have to make the decision to dispose of it, and then and that's something we've said all along, is that typically in these state processes there's significant collaboration with the local municipality on kind of what happens for those projects. But it's not something where I'll give the example of the Legion Hall, which is in private ownership right now. Those guys could sell tomorrow to a 40B developer. Smaller site, different dynamic. But that's kind of the difference between state ownership and private ownership.
Yeah, well, my concern was the insinuation was that tomorrow somebody could act upon the salt sheds and a 40B project would be moving forward. So, and that would be something that there would be no control over. So the reason I asked the question, I want to make sure that those neighbors don't feel threatened that that's going to happen to them. And I do have one last point on affordable housing, and this is really for all of us. The select board article, it had a 10% factor for only the dwellings that had greater than 10 residential units per dwelling. So, and I agree with what Cheryl was saying, and I understand, Tim, when you said permanent, it's not permanent. As long as the number of residents in town are rising, we're going to have to continue to find affordable housing to stay with what we're required to by state. So any dwelling under 10 puts us in the other direction. We start losing ground that we've gained. So we're going to have to continue to find more affordable housing if that development plan creates market rate housing.
So on that point of the affordable housing, Tim, you had said before town meeting that you had put together a scope of work for that economic analysis. It seems to me that could move forward at this time, right?
Yeah, and I actually I've been talking with some of my colleagues at Mass Housing Partnership, which has been working with a number of firms that have been doing this work, and also with the state, which has kind of commissioned a lot of these or kind of reviews a lot of these reports. Just trying to figure out what a budget figure would look like, and also kind of what firm. So I actually have I have a meeting with MAPC next week, which has done a number of these. If that's something that if they come back with a number that makes sense, I'll bring it to the board. We wouldn't have to procure that; we could contract with them directly. But if not, the scope of work is, I don't know if I've shown it to you. It's very simple. It's do the thing that demonstrates what the state wants. Effectively, it's a little bit more elegantly put than that. But all we're looking for is the analysis that follows the instructions in the state's guidelines for doing these feasibility analysis. So the scope of work is very simple. It's just a matter of, who does it, what's the budget, and how long is the sort of procurement process. So I will be able to have a little bit more. I'll probably do that in my staff update next week. Just based on my conversation with MAPC. I know RKG has been doing these. There's a couple other firms. But if MAPC comes back with a number that is acceptable to the board, it may make sense to just go with them. It's quicker. We can get it done without having to go through a procurement. I don't think a procurement would take that long. The firms that are doing this have been doing a bunch of them. They have the capacity. They know what to do. So it wouldn't necessarily be a month-long exercise of, trying to like find somebody. But I'll have a little bit more to report on that next week.
But one of the things that I just wanted to mention, because I talked to Tim about this, is I read Lexington has an excellent economic feasibility study on their website. And one of the things that is fundamental is an evaluation of the districts. So if we spend money to have them do a study of Granite Ave and do a feasibility study, Lexington was actually able to obtain any buildings 8 units or greater could have 15%. So not even a 10 unit, it was an 8 unit could have 15%. But part of their study was to do the districts. And so that's my only concern is if that district changes, what does that do to our feasibility study, and have we wasted money?
And I just was going to ask, HLC has set how these need to be done, right? So I guess my question would be, I think it's important to answer Meredith's question about do they need to know the districts? And I'm sure they need to know the kind of housing. So if you're allowing 3 units versus if you're allowing, how many of your units are allowed in districts that allow 40 units an acre, for example, right? Because that's a different housing product. But I still think it would be good to have someone lined up and ready to go, because I think one way to think about improving zoning is we could do some of it in pieces. We don't have to do it all at once. So if affordability could be done a standalone, why not? Because everybody wants to see that number increased.
Okay.
And if a district changes, then some of it won't change. So how much would it be to update the analysis, Tim? So, it might not be a lot to update it to, take one district out and add another, or change one district and add another, if it's not the whole thing shifting. Because, some of what's been outlined, as I said, when I was breaking up earlier, I think it's a lot to do. I really think that the community engagement is really important. And I'm really concerned about the timeline for May. If we said we want to do it right, I think we really need to outline a schedule and a realistic schedule. And that includes all of this consultant work, because we know we were disappointed in the timing of some of the consultant work in last year. So I do think outreach on that is important.
I agree. I think that we should have somebody lined up and ready to go. Great. Okay.
So how are we leaving that particular topic in terms of getting somebody lined up? What's our action, or what are we asking?
Tim said he'd come back next week with after he meets with MAPC. I think that's a good next update.
Yeah, I'll in my materials that I send out tomorrow, I'll include the proposed scope of work. Like I said, it's very simple. It's, we're looking for someone to do the analysis that the state lays out in its guidelines. And the state has, pretty specific instructions for what they're looking for and what kind of evidence and data they're interested in. To Meredith's point, the Lexington study is super duper detailed. That maybe I can send that around as well, just so folks can look at it. It goes a little bit above and beyond what the state's requirements are. if that's something that the board's interested in, then absolutely we can, adjust that scope of work. But what the state is looking for is relatively basic. But I'll send out that scope of work. I'll send out the Lexington study. And again, I'll have that conversation with MAPC next week. And again, that's a situation where if they have a budget that the board is amenable to, we don't have to go through a procurement process. We can just contract with them directly. Otherwise, it's we've got to put it out to 3 firms and wait to hear back from all 3, and then pick one based on the lowest figure. So you'll see the scope of work. If you have any suggestions, edits, additions, subtractions, certainly you can discuss that. I'll also send out the Lexington report so you can see kind of what that looks like.
Terrific. And maybe to Cheryl, to what you were saying is, maybe we look at doing, I would be happy to work with Tim on site plan approval, looking at improving that. It seems like there's some things that we could do that we could bring back to the board, or, we break out and maybe have different people work on different aspects of this to try to move it forward. But I'm open to discussing that at our next meeting. Let's just move on to the last item, the discussion of legal consulting assistance for zoning drafting. This was simply, again, I think until we get our districts and sort of know what the planning board wants, I don't know that we necessarily would want to hire a legal consultant unless, once we have something in place that we would be working on the design guidelines, standards, language, again, for site plan approval review. I think that's really the time that we would want to hire a legal counsel. But I want to hear from other board members on this and how that could best be utilized, because I think we've always said this is law, whatever we put forward, that we think we should have an attorney, whether to make recommendations on something that we should add to our article, or just a change of wording with our guidelines and with our standards. But that's why we put it on there. So,
I think because we're in such a time crunch, it would be good to have somebody on the ready. So when we get to that point, we can hand them our documents. They can give us a once over. I don't know what that means. I doubt we'd have to have somebody on retainer, but maybe we could have somebody lined up. I don't know where that starts, but that's what I would do. I was running this thing. Have somebody ready.
Somebody
to
who
review.
specializes in zoning
Oh,
language.
yeah, of course. Yeah.
And I think that's not a bad idea, because there's other things that the recodification, I think we want, to develop a relationship with a legal counsel who specializes in zoning language.
So my understanding, and maybe you can just get this confirmed, is that we have budget for planning and zoning and not legal. So the question is, can our budget be used for legal? That's the first question. And because town meeting approved the budget, based on what it was intended use was. Then the second question is, the planning board doesn't have a capacity to engage and get into a contract or enter into a contract with anyone. So when we've said that we've hired consultants, it's been through the planning department. So who actually, I understand the select board is the only entity that can engage directly with attorneys, and that they have an agreement with a law firm that's town council, and that's the process. So that's what my understanding is, and I don't necessarily think we need to debate it. I just would like somebody to look into
We should
it and
explore it.
confirm it.
Who reviewed the select board's article?
Town council.
Oh, okay.
And town council reviews all zoning articles, in my experience on the board. And the attorney general does in the end,
Right.
also.
Maggie, you have your hand up?
Oh, yes, thanks. So I agree that I think we need outside counsel to help the planning board with writing zoning. I think the planning board was so fortunate for so long to have Alex Whiteside on the board, and we became sort of dependent on him, especially since he did work for the Department of Housing. So I think even though we all have great talents, none of us are attorneys. And zoning bylaws are laws and are legally enforceable. And I think we need to have our own attorney to write our bylaws, especially like the MBTA Communities Act, which is, you know, as we've stated, the biggest zoning change since 1938. And so I think that the planning board is able to hire our own consultants. My understanding is, and I could be wrong, but my understanding is that town council's the one who would enter into litigation. But I think the planning board has our own right to hire consultants. And to me, we talked about in the past hiring Bob Mitchell to write our zoning. And we were all kind of for hiring Bob Mitchell as our zoning consultant, but he wasn't an attorney. So to me, what's the difference between hiring a Bob Mitchell, who is not an attorney, to write zoning, and then hiring a lawyer to write zoning? We're just writing zoning. We want to make sure that every I is dotted and T is crossed. I personally went through a situation in my own business where town meeting passed something that was incorrect, and I had to go back to town meeting to change it because there was a reference. The one thing we needed an attorney for, it was wrong. So I think, to Jim's point, the spring is going to be here before we know it. I think we should take a vote to hire an outside consultant to help us write zoning. Lexington, we've already referenced Lexington earlier tonight. Lexington has their own zoning, which is different than the template that was provided by the state. And I like the flexibility of writing our own bylaw, just like Lexington did. So I think we should take a vote tonight on hiring. We don't have to necessarily go out and act and hire them tomorrow. But I think we should get our ducks in a row and be ready to do it.
I just want to say one thing about Lexington. I reviewed Lexington's MBTA zoning and their site plan review procedure that's referenced in that zoning. It's not very detailed. It's not as detailed as ours. And so I think we need to be clear about what we're looking for, you know, in terms of, you know, what are we asking for someone to do? Start from scratch. We have something that's, you know, had some review, and, you know, is it a matter of improving what passed, or is it a matter of starting from scratch? I personally think that before everyone makes that decision, they should actually read these other bylaws. And I started to do it, but there's been 12 that have passed now. So, you know, before deciding that ours isn't any good, you know, start making the comparisons. Because when I read Lexington, I was like, they don't have nearly the level of detail we do in site plan approval. There's no submission requirements. They don't tell you what you need to submit. There's very few design guidelines. It's really, so I think we need some discussion.
Yeah, so we don't have
about
to do
what we're intending
exactly,
to accomplish.
exactly what Lexington did. I don't have a problem hiring a consultant and having them steer us one way or the other. We don't have to be married to anything in particular. So that's a discussion for when we actually, hire somebody and then we give them some direction. Right now, this point is just to, hire somebody or get the board on board with hiring somebody to help us. And then we can figure that out later.
And
I guess what I would like to suggest is a
Yeah.
budget. We have
Mhm.
some things that we're talking about trying to get accomplished, whether it's a traffic study, an economic feasibility study, design standards and guidelines, further build out analysis and so forth. Do we have funds to do all of these things in our budget, including hiring an attorney? So I'd like to see, before we make any vote on getting somebody on board, that we put a budget together for all the things that have been talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I still think the most important thing is getting the language correct. And, I think, getting an attorney is step one.
Mhm.
I think what Meredith suggested, step one is the districts I agree with. And I'd like to understand how much we have available to us if UTIL is, or MAPC is necessary really on the GIS piece of this, how much money do we have available there? And then the end of the fiscal year is the end of June, as I believe. So we do have our funds through the end of June, but if it went beyond for a fall time meeting, we would have another fiscal year of funds available. So I do think it would be prudent to look at each component that was discussed and put a price to it.
So Maggie, you're not saying hire a lawyer tomorrow. You're just saying get consensus from the board to hire someone to look at our written bylaws when the time comes.
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
That might not be a bad idea.
I would agree with that, but I agree with what Cheryl was saying in that we do have a lot of good work that has gone into this, what the select board's article has, a lot of good language for design guidelines, standards. I think it still falls, short of what we ultimately should have, but that we wouldn't start from scratch. We wouldn't be hiring somebody from, we would take a lot of the good work that we've done and implement that, look at our zoning district, our districts, adding these improvements, and then having somebody sort of assess where we are as far as site plan approval, legality, and so forth. So I would support looking at doing research on zoning attorneys and getting some ballpark estimates to bring back to the board. Maggie, would you be comfortable with that being a motion?
Yes, I would. So moved.
Is there a second?
I still
Second.
would,
Sorry.
I would
Second.
still like confirmation on how our budget can be used and whether and who would engage the actual
Right.
attorney.
Right.
Before, so that make that part of the investigation, I guess, and I would support that. So if you are amenable to that friendly amendment, Maggie?
Yes, yep.
Okay. And Jim,
Yes.
do you support the?
Yeah, that's fine.
Well, so it's, Maggie made a motion to investigate hiring an attorney to review the zoning, to work on zoning. Exact scope is to be determined. I said,
And the financial,
and
the cost of what that would be.
And I said that I would like to include confirmation that our funds can be used for that purpose.
A zoning consultant,
A
legal zoning
legal,
consultant.
Because we know we can hire consultants.
Yes, a legal
It's
zoning
the
consultant.
legal, and also that we have the authority to do so. In other words, that.
Yeah, and like to your
select
point,
board
I've asked,
doesn't have the sole authority.
I have asked multiple times for documentation, showing that the select board has the sole authority in hiring outside legal. So they have had ample opportunity to provide that to me and they have yet to do it. So I'll just ask again. So,
I think that,
And I think it's specific to zoning is what we just,
yeah, because I think
That's-
previously it was questioning the law itself. And I would definitely wouldn't support that. And I don't think that's what we've been
Right.
discussing.
this is,
So I do think it's a slightly different ask, Maggie.
yep, no, I agree. That's what I didn't say we were looking at.
all right, so we have a motion, a second. Let's do a roll call since we're hybrid. Sean?
Do you wanna like, just state the whole motion?
Sure, do you want to go through it one more time? All right. Maggie, do you want to state the motion?
The motion is for the planning board to investigate hiring an outside zoning attorney to help us write the MBTA Communities Act zoning bylaw.
And
It-
to investigate whether the planning board's funds can be used for that purpose and whether the planning board has authority to hire outside counsel for this purpose.
And to obtain a
Just for this
cost,
purpose.
and to obtain a cost estimate.
And to obtain the cost estimate.
But
Yeah.
if the
Yeah.
consultant happens to be a lawyer. We're
Right.
not gonna hire
That's-
them because they're a lawyer.
Well, their services are different. Their services aren't legal
Yeah.
services,
Right.
right? So I think it's the question of the legal
Yeah.
service aspect of it.
But you can
Okay.
also still-
Yeah.
Is that, sorry, Julia. eyes are-
Julia,
Is that-
just draft something and I can review it before
Is
our meeting next week. I'll review the meeting minutes for next week.
Is that clear? Do you want us to go over it one more time? Sorry.
I can motion tape again.
Okay, all right, and we'll check the minutes. Okay, great. So roll call, Sean,
Yes.
Jim,
Yes.
Maggie,
Yes.
Cheryl,
Yes.
myself, yes. Great. All right, thank you.
Cool.
And Tim, was there anything else that you feel like you want to just wrap this up? And any questions on the mapping that you'll be able to possibly provide for us to just spend some time with before?
Yeah,
meet?
any compliance model sheets that we have that have a geography in them, I will get to you. I think in the relatively near future, any new geographies that you want to test, if we can identify those, and so we can get those into a model sheet to kind of experiment with, that would be good. We talked about the economic feasibility analysis. I will send you that scope of work, and we'll have a little bit more information about a potential price from MAPC, and some other vendors that we've been talking to. And then, I mean, in terms of this conversation about legal services, who's spearheading this? Is this something that members are going to take a look at? I mean, aside from, I think the question of, the planning board's budget status, and kind of, the authority, we can, run those questions up the flagpole, but in terms of the actual nitty gritty of the work, understanding like who's going to take the lead on that would be good.
I'm happy to look at and do some research, and other members also to learn about other zoning attorneys, the well-known zoning attorneys in the community.
I can send you a couple of names.
Okay.
If you want to reach out to them.
Yeah. And I don't plan to interview them, but I would like to get some recommendations and references for them. Yeah.
And then I
wanted
think,
to ask
going back to the conversation about kind of the priorities, and the sort of the principles, is that going to be something that folks are going to send me stuff and I can try to organize it? Are we going to discuss it further next week? Do we want to set a deadline of some day next week, where I can get things? I think a lot of that is going to entail refinement by the board members. I don't want to do anything besides kind of organize stuff for you all. So just having an expectation of when I can expect, those materials to come in would be helpful.
I will, since I suggested the scorecard, I can do a draft of a scorecard that we can populate, if that would be helpful, Tim. But it also, I think, would be helpful if you pull the prior districts and send them, that I'll plug those into the scorecard just to have the list, and then we can discuss it at the meeting. But on the new geographies, before, Tim, you said you didn't want to look at geography outside of direction at a meeting. So are we planning to send geography suggestions to you, which you will compile, and then we'll discuss at the next meeting before sending anything off to you, Till?
You tell me. I can, we can do that.
I personally would like to review all of the ones that we looked at already before making that. So if we could do that first. So a recap, Tim. And I know that none of them are going to be a complete model, but we could just look at the district and what parameters were plugged in. And if we said, okay, that district makes sense with those parameters, but with different parameters, to me, that's a starting point rather than just pulling things out of the sky.
I agree, Cheryl, I agree with you. And I think that should be done as a group. I think we'll be more productive if we do that evaluation together.
Okay.
I would agree.
Are we doing our scorecard on those 7 principles? Is that part of it?
Yeah, the principles I think we could send to Tim.
Okay, it's like 1, 2, 3, just.
I'll start a score sheet based on what he already had done. I'll add a few that I've been thinking of, and we can add anybody else's to it. And then we can decide which ones to keep and which ones to eliminate.
Yeah, and I think my understanding of this exercise, which I think is a good one and a crucial one, is, we've already got a bunch of sub-districts, and you can't kind of forget about those, but almost kind of trying to do a little bit of a reset and kind of get back to step one of like, what is important to this board, and how are we going to judge things, maybe not necessarily objectively, but in a systematic way, more than just, we've heard all the complaints about, and this is going to unfortunately still be a numbers game, because, you'll see these models and we all understand how the compliance works. But, if there's going to be more to it than the numbers game, you all should know at the outset, these are our priorities. These are how we're going to judge whether these districts are good or bad. Beyond just, do they, add up to what we need them to add up to. And so, we talked, over the course of the process, preserving the physical character of the neighborhood. That's a big, weighty thing. If that's important, that should be a priority. Cheryl mentioned proximity to transit. We did hear, some conflicting input, over the course of this process of, why are we doing so much outside the transit area? This is supposed to be transit-oriented zoning versus why are we not spreading this out more so that not a single neighborhood is taking the hit? So you all will have to juggle that and kind of figure out, which is important and how you weight that stuff. But I think, approaching every sub-district through that lens of these are our priorities is going to be a good first step. So I think it's a great idea. I think looking forward to assisting with that.
So perhaps everybody send their suggestions by next Wednesday, Tim, or what deadline would be good for you?
I mean, if it's something that you want to kind of talk about next week, before Wednesday would be good, just so I can get something out the night before the meeting, so you could at least potentially look at it beforehand. But we could also kind of talk about it live or wait until next week. Did we agree on another meeting date for the week after next?
That was the other question that I had. We did not. Yeah. How does that following week?
I'm over. I'm
When are you talking
It would be,
Martin Luther
so the
King.
11th, not next week we meet the 11th, so it'd be the 18th. We are also meeting on the 25th, so
I can do that.
18th good for folks?
Yep.
It's
I
7
can-
o'clock, right?
All right, let's plan on that. That will be great.
And that's MBTA specific?
Yeah.
MBTA specific.
And we're gonna do citizen speak for that one, or we're gonna just be here?
We will be doing citizen speak on the 11th. I always encourage everybody to come to citizen speak, but I feel like this will be an important meeting just to focus on criteria and maybe to be most efficient with looking at districts.
If we don't take public comment at that meeting, I think we absolutely need public comment on the criteria and the maps. Because this will be the foundation
Yeah,
for everything that happens later. And if people don't get comment then they're gonna be offering comment like a step.
on the
down road.
25th.
not saying no comment.
So maybe
I'm
do-
saying until we have something to offer.
That's until they know what we're actually
Okay.
discussing.
I'm just suggesting not too much later than that. there be
No, I
feedback.
agree. Yeah, yep, I
I'm
agree.
saying We're gonna be meeting a lot.
Yeah.
There'll be a lot of public comment.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I might have the climate action committee meeting
On the 18th.
on the 18th.
On the 18th.
And I missed the one in December because my mother was sick. So
Could we meet on the 17th then?
I could.
Wednesday, the
I can.
17th? I can meet them. 17th. All right. Yeah, I agree. We want feedback. That's obviously why we're doing this, so.
or maybe like on Citizen Speak, we just hear from new people at this.
I think
Tough
we
to
should-
regulate.
no, I don't think we should do that. I think what we should do is limit it to the discussion of the criteria and the district maps.
But do you want to do that before we discuss the criteria?
No.
That's what I was saying. Yeah, let's do it. It may have to be the 25th or the following meeting. The 25th, we may have a lot of people on 111 Highland who may want to speak.
Yeah.
So I rather, yeah, so, but definitely before we make too much,
Well, we need to have a calendar. I
Mhm.
mean, we need to have a schedule. We need to understand. So
Mhm.
if Tim, next week can tell us when, any of this, I mean, I'm really dubious about the May town meeting because of
mhm,
backing up from that. So I think we need, as we set these dates, if we don't
Mhm.
have any time for public review until February, the warrant closing January
Mhm,
17th.
I have asked
when
for a
would you have
placeholder. I've asked for a placeholder to be put on, actually on the agenda for the select board's meeting for next week. So we'll have something. My understanding is I'm hearing consensus that we do want to try to move forward. We've got a lot to get done, but that we would like to try to,
I think we need to be
See if it's possible.
realistic though, so
Yep.
we need to see
Okay.
a schedule.
Mhm.
And I think if Tim has information about when the warrant committee, even if you get a placeholder, you still have to have time for the select board to review it, the
Mhm.
warrant committee to review it. It has to have backup to go to print. You have to hold a public hearing.
Yep.
I just think we need a calendar that puts all of these things in.
Yep.
And
We'll
then
review
what
that.
are we willing not to have done? Because I don't think all these 7 items are
Mhm.
gonna be done by then.
Mhm.
So, and then if you're starting from scratch on zoning language, I mean, how do you even have a placeholder? So it's, I think there's a lot to agree to and to
You're starting to sound like
discuss.
me a month ago.
Mhm.
Well, I
Alright.
think you've offered plenty of us to think about and consider, Cheryl, between now and the next meeting. I'd like to make a motion to adjourn this meeting.
I'll second.
Okay. All right, roll call on that. If there's not Anything else that we need to set? We've got our dates set. We'll be able to discuss further information. Tim, we'll get those items to you as soon as possible. Okay, great. Thank you all for meeting this evening, and
Thank you.
roll call to adjourn. Sean,
Yes.
Maggie,
Yes.
Jim, Cheryl,
Yes.
and myself, yes. Thank you all. Good
Thank
evening.
you. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you.
Okay, just to be clear, we're meeting on the 11th, the 18th, and the